Wampler Pinnacle Deluxe? Is it a Marshall in a box? We're going to put it in front of a Fender Blues Jr. and find out today, right here on GearGasms. Welcome to GearGasms, kids. I'm your host, Alan Barnes. Today we've got this toy right here. It's the Wampler Pinnacle Deluxe. This is the V2. This is extremely versatile little distortion pedal. We're going to put this thing in front of the Fender Blues Junior today and find out if we can take that from a very, very Fendery tone, a very un-Marshall-like tone, and see if we can get a Marshall sound with just a simple box in front of a simple amp. T-shirt shout out time, kids. It's Def Leppard. They were British. They use a Union Jack in their logo, and let me tell you something, their first 3 albums totally done on Marshall amps. They toured with Marshall amps for decades, so we thought if we're going to try to get a Marshall sound out of a Fender amp, what better band to rock the logo of than Def Leppard? Alright kids, for today's test we're going to be plugging this here Epiphone Les Paul. It does have DiMarzio Super Distortion pickups in it. We're going to plug this into the Fender Blues Junior because you really need a Les Paul to test out the Marshall properties of the Wampler Pinnacle Deluxe pedal. So to get things started, we're going to start off showing you what the clean sound of this thing is, and then we'll kick in the Pinnacle. Now, as you can see, that's about as far away from a Marshall tone as you can get. It's very Fendery, and that's what we want to hear out of a Fender amp. But let's pretend that this is the only amp you have, and there are songs where you need that clean Fender, but there are also songs where you need that heavy-hitting Marshall tone, and you don't happen to have one. Well, Wampler has the answer. It's a series of dirt pedals that aficionados refer to as an MIAB, Marshall in a box. And these pedals all purport to be able to give you a Marshall tone at the flick of a switch. So we're going to try flicking those switches on the Wampler Pinnacle Deluxe and see if that's actually true. Now, as you can hear right there, right from the get-go, wow, that sounds a lot like a Marshall. Now, I did take some time to sort of dial this in before we started this video to get us closer. One of the most important things, I think, for dialing in a Marshall-esque tone is to get the EQ right and to be careful not to use too much gain, because Marshalls aren't nearly as gainy as a lot of people think. Another thing, when people say you're going to get a Marshall tone, what is a Marshall tone? A Marshall tone can be a lot of things. It can be like 60s Marshalls like the JTM 45 Blues Breaker. It can be late 60s, 70s Plexi stuff. It can be on into the 80s, 90s with the JCM and the JVM series. So when people say a Marshall tone, that's really kind of hard to pin down. It's actually a much broader spectrum of tones than a lot of people are initially led to believe. Now let's try dialing in some of the tones a little bit. I've got the gain just a little bit before noon. I have the bass pulled back a little bit. Let's flatten everything. Flatten all of our EQs. And right here you'll notice there's a vintage and a modern switch. You definitely want to go with the vintage. We could ignore this switch right for now because we're not playing around with the boost. So let me play a chord. When you turn the gain all the way down, the volume goes away because the gain sort of works with the volume control in a very amp-like fashion. It's not just going to give you a clean throughput sound. It makes the volume essentially go away. And sort of like an amp, you've got your master volume, and then as you turn up the gain, you'll get sound that comes into the audio picture. let's mess with the sag a little bit and see what we get. Sag sort of simulates the tube sag with heavier pickups that normally cause the feel to get a little spongier, a little more touch responsive. We currently have the sag disengaged, and now we're going to engage it. Now I like the sag disengaged. Maybe that's okay with single coil pickups. It's not really my thing. All right, now we're going to mess with the tone controls a little bit on the Pinnacle, mess around with the gain a little bit more and see what we get. See what kind of flavors of Marshall we can get, just how high gain we can push this thing, how subtle it can be. Maybe we'll pop the boost circuit in there as well, just to sort of show you how this thing performs across its spectrum of controls. Again, with the most non-Marshall-like of amps, the Fender Blues Junior. Uh-oh. You hear that hiss? Just like a Marshall. All right, kids. We've played around with that. We saw right away. Sure, you can get some really, really good Marshall-like tones with this beast. I love it. Let's look at just the boost side, because that's kind of a Marshall flavor too. At the risk of Wampler getting sued by Ibanez, it's basically a tube screamer. Again, this is the clean, unaffected bypass tone. Now, let's give it a boost. Without the boost. With the boost. All right, that was pretty cool. Let's try doing something else that's cool. We're going to first punch the distortion, and then we're going to mash our fist into the boost and just see what the combination does again. Remember, what you're hearing, it's a Fender Blues Junior. Can you believe it? Now we're going to do the same thing, except we're going into the gain mode. We had it in boost mode for the boost side. It also has a gain mode, which behaves just a little differently. Let's A/B that and see how that sounds. Now, one really cool thing that the boost button does is if you want to run a little lower gain just for some rhythm tones, but you really want that lead to jump in everybody's face and make their skull explode wherever you're playing, you can kind of use that as kind of a solo boost or taking it to that next level. So we've got the gain turned down, and let's see how it sounds when we kick in the boost. Well, what did we learn today, kids? We learned that the manufacturers claim that the Pinnacle Deluxe is a Marshall in a box, or maybe the manufacturer doesn't claim that. Maybe that's just what people say. We'll have to ask Brian Wampler if he makes that claim. But it does a very, very good job of taking an amp that probably couldn't be any more different from a Marshall than if it were like a Roland JC120. The Fender Blues Junior is about as un-Marshall as you can get. It does its own thing, it has its own sound, and that's a beautiful Fender, clean, vintage sound. You can make it hairy for sure, but when you throw the Wampler Pinnacle Deluxe in front of it, you absolutely can get very, very Marshall-esque high gain tones and still use that little amp for all the other songs that you play that don't need those tones. Now, one thing I didn't show you were the controls on the top of the Fender Blues Junior, but I can tell you pretty much everything was flattened. All the EQs were straight up. We didn't use a whole lot of gain. You heard the clean tone. It was sort of maybe on the edge of breakup, but very, very clean. Just a little bit of reverb. And again, all the EQs are neutral. So you can also, along with this pedal, do a whole lot of granular dialing in on the Fender amp as well and make all kinds of different sounds. It's pretty versatile. You throw this pedal in front of it and suddenly you have a rig that's capable of running the full gamut from A to Z. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. We're always going to be here making fun, informative videos about gear. We love having you here. We love the comments. Thank you for your time as always. I'm Alan Barnes saying we'll see you here again next week on GearGasms.